I think the best marketing for your game is simply having people know who you are well enough that when it's like, all right, hey, there's a new Tyler Crumrine game, like people are like, you know, they like Tyler Crumrine. And yeah, it really is. It's, you know, I don't think be sleazy about it, but just like be a person.
My name is Jeremy Gage, and welcome to the Draw Your Dice podcast. This is an educational show involving all things tabletop role-playing industry. Listen alongside me as we hear from creators, entrepreneurs, and supporters about their personal best practices, principles, and philosophies. I encourage anyone from the budding game designer to a seasoned publisher and everyone in between to sit down with us and enjoy today's episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Draw Your Dice, this being the third one. I might legitimately count all the way to 52 by the end of the year, just so people know. Today, I am joined with a really multi-hatted individual who has created a great game in the form of Beak, Feather, and Bone. He is also the editor over at Plays in Verse. I would like to welcome Tyler Crumrine.
Hello. Happy to be here. Thank you so much for flaunting COVID guidelines and bringing in this huge studio audience. To applaud for me and my gaming knowledge.
To all 200 of you not wearing masks literally 4 feet from us, we appreciate your bravery. No, we're joking.
No, I've always said you're the Jimmy Fallon of RPG podcasts. So you know, even 3 episodes in, the people have chosen.
Oh, shoot. I don't know about being compared to Jimmy Fallon.
Yeah,
I'll take it.
I realized after saying that. It's like, all right, well.
What a goofball he is. Well, Tyler, before we sort of get into the game design, the business, the meat of the podcast, why don't you introduce yourself as you present yourself to the world for the people at home?
Yeah, I'm Tyler Crumrine, he, him. And I am, like Jeremy said, I wear a lot of hats. My career thus far, for the last decade or so, has been in theater and publishing. I work as a dramaturg, which is the most pretentious role in theater. Essentially, what a dramaturg is someone who helps to develop new plays or does historical research on existing plays. So sometimes I'm the one explaining like the Shakespeare dick jokes and program notes. Sometimes I am the one who is like in the editor's role for a play the same way that like an editor would help to hone a novel that's in progress. And then Plays in Verse is my publishing company for experimental theater where I get to have my cake and eat it too. There are a lot of plays that are going up on stages that I will, I'll be in the rehearsal room and work on. But there are even more plays that don't get the same kind of wide amount of performances because they are a little too niche or they're a little too experimental. And a lot of times those plays don't get published either. So what I do is I run a small press that takes those like very interesting but not very commercial plays and publishes them the way you would a book of poetry. So all this to say that on top of just being a games hobbyist for a long time and someone who's very interested in printed word and kind of performance literature in general, which I think RPGs fall into as well as theater, I have been very lucky to get involved with game design, to get involved with the Brain Trust RPG design community, and I launched a Kickstarter for the game that I was most confident in, Beak, Feather, and Bone, for Zine Quest in 2020. It did very well, and kind of since then, especially after theaters shut down for the pandemic, I've really been leaning into game design as a way that I can create the same kind of, emergent storytelling experiences, performance storytelling, and also create the kind of like community, which is why I like theater, but within microcosms. So by releasing these RPGs that can be played digitally through, Discord, or games that you can play within like a 2 or 3 person bubble. I feel like even though the world is terrifying and different right now, I feel like I'm still kind of being able to flex the muscles that I've built over the years to create the kind of art that, I want to see and that I believe in.
That's amazing. Truly. What an introduction, for sure. And it's interesting that you touch on sort of the digital components of moving into that sort of framework for creating games, because we had Spencer and Adam on here, Adam Bell and Spencer Campbell, on previous episodes already, and both of them alluded to thinking like game designers should be thinking about, we don't have access to the table anymore in groups of 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever have you. So we really have to start thinking about the virtual tabletop and Discord and all these other tools that are out there. Miro, which I just learned about like 2 days ago, to facilitate playing games now, sort of like combining the tabletop and almost video game space, sort of. Yeah, I think that's awesome. Tyler, for the folks at home, I always like to, you've already displayed very much that you are far more than just a game designer, but what was sort of your first maybe game that kind of wanted you to push into game design, that really sparked something within you and said, I could hack this, or this is what I want to make? And what was sort of that starting muse moment for you?
Yeah, I grew up in a pretty conservative Christian household, and very much during like the period when there was a bit of another kind of satanic panic going on. Not the original one with Dungeons and Dragons, but with like the popularity of Harry Potter, there was kind of a renewed like skepticism, especially of Christian parents, towards anything with like magic in it. I remember my friends were super into the Magic the Gathering card game, and the way that I could justify playing with them to my parents was by playing a Plains Angel deck. So I could be like, oh, I'm the good guys. Like, yes, it is all magic and there are demons in this game, but like I'm running an Angels deck, which was not very good, but at least I was able to play with them. And so I really came to RPGs, as an adult, post-theater education, as a theater professional. I had a number of friends who were performers, were comedians, who had been interested in D&D. And so I was just like, hey, I'll buy the books. Like, I'll GM, I'll run stuff for you. And so I started out just playing Dungeons and Dragons, really GMing way more than I ever played anything. And I really loved it, but I did not enjoy the prep at all. And so the first kind of like game design that I did was almost out of like, I don't know if it's very fair to myself to call it laziness, but like I hated doing all this writing and pre-prep work and like coming up with all these ideas for branching paths and stuff, when I would much rather just like at the start of the session sit down with my players and be like, hey, let's do this little exercise to like brainstorm directions we would be interested in going in, and etc. And so that kind of start of like making these like little mini games for the campaigns that I was running, and then later starting to play more indie games like Fiasco and The Quiet Year and things like that, that ultimately bled into now my design process, where many of the games I make are still very much like, how can I gamify like the boring parts of, running an RPG? How can we redistribute the creative energy so that it's everyone kind of creating stuff together, as opposed to, one person doing like the whale's share of the labor.
No, I love that, because so I think we rode a very similar train in our approach or being exposed to tabletop games. I played maybe twice as a player, and everyone's schedules were all wonky, so it was really hard to get people back together, to get the GM to like prep things to be ready. And we were playing like maybe once a month, once every 2 months, and I was like, I need more. This just feels good to me for some reason. And so I donned the mantle. I've never not been a GM since putting on the mantle. And I agree with you, especially when D&D is sort of the first game you create or touch base on, because as the GM, the game kind of gives you this loose poetic of telling you have to like write a novel for your players essentially, and all that prep is like bonkers for someone to first start to feel good about their first sort of campaign. I mean, you can definitely have the gonzo fun of someone getting stuck in the gelatinous cube and you roll a 1 on the skill check and you whoopee cushion yourself into unexistence. But no, I totally love that your want for game design was to make the pieces of essentially the GM portion of traditional games, I guess traditional constituting things like before the 2000s, maybe? I don't know when that, I'm not a scholar of the tabletop game. Someone else will correct me in the comments 10 years from now and hit me with it. But that's why I love games like Heart, the City Beneath, which just came out as of the date of this podcast. It sort of has like the calling system and says, hey, each player picks 2 story beats. You focus on those 2 story beats. Neither of you have to be surprised about what the other is expecting from this game. And I think that sort of stuff is cool. And how you created Beak, Feather, and Bone to sort of facilitate. I mean, what a great transition we have here. So getting into
because, like, real quick before we move on from GM stuff, like first to speak on your point that Dungeons and Dragons creates the expectation of someone writing like a world Bible in order to play the game. You know, so much of that is how they continue to monetize the game. Like, you know, the reason why they're able to sell like the Curse of Strahd over and over and over again is because they perpetuating that myth of the GM needing to do like all of this work and labor and writing, you know, someone looking at that and being intimidated by that is the selling point of a setting book that they might buy, of, you know, not having to do that insurmountable amount of work. And then another thing is that like GMs should be treated more like players than they are, you know. Like, they aren't just the referee. The fact of the matter is that, like, there should be fun things for GMs to do. There should be choices for GMs to make. There should be opportunities for GMs to be surprised by creativity. You know, so many games just see them as, like, a part of the machinery, when really they should be treated more like, you know, like almost a distinct class within like the apocalypse world framework of, you know, someone who is making moves and things like that, which is part of why I kind of like the direction that game design has been going in, of like giving GMs more defined like tasks and responsibilities and spreading those out, but also making sure like that the things that you say that a GM has to do are actually fun things to do.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not a big fan of games that are like, hey, the GM never rolls, because I'm like, well, rolling dice is fun.
Yeah. No, I 6,000% agree with legitimately every single word that just came out of your mouth, for sure. Not that I haven't agreed with everything you've said so far, but no, certainly, you know, D&D is sort of like, now that I've played games like Band of Blades, Blades in the Dark, like Band of Blades does a great job of distributing like the old GM responsibilities to other players. Someone's writing eulogies about NPCs that die. Someone's picking the missions that people go on. Other people are managing lots of characters. You know, like we just talked about Hearts and your game with sort of the map making role playing game. There's just, I agree with you. I think the movement forward of creating GM as player instead of GM as word god almost. Sort of like storyteller.
Omnipotent facilitator.
Yeah. That just says, okay, this is a fireplace and there are fire enemies and you have to save the fire princess. Like, and I never thought about it before, about that sort of model of creating the expectation of the novel writing for D&D and then selling novels to the GMs, right? Like, okay, if you're scared to do it, we have 12 books here that all have that
Yeah.
you're still going to have to do heavy load on, right? Like you're still going to have to do all that extra novel work on top of getting Cursive Strahd. Like you have to figure out how all that interconnects and what your players want. And there's just so many other facets. Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head, and I'd never really thought about it like that before. So yeah, let's talk about Beak, Feather, and
Birds.
Bone here. Yeah, let's talk about birds.
Let's talk birds. Where do they get off their hollow bones? I think they're so cool flying around in the sky.
Too close to the sun.
Yeah, let's talk Beak, Feather, and Bone.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we talked about this a little bit off air, but you were really surprised by how well this did on Kickstarter. So I think before we get into the meat of the design, I think I'd like you to, for people who are listening and learning, I'd like you to touch base just a tiny bit about sort of that Kickstarter process and what was it like feeling your expectations being blown out of the water when you came into this thinking like, oh, I'll just probably, barely get it here.
Yeah, so it was really weird. It's one of those things where I had done some like casual hobbyist game design type stuff, participated in some game jams and things like that, but really wasn't sharing my work a lot, in large part because of just lack of confidence, lack of self-esteem type things. I did not consider myself a real game designer. And really it was kind of the success of 2019's Zine Quest and seeing folks that I really respect and being lucky enough to work on some of those zine quests. Adam Voss of World Champ Game Co. is a good friend. He's also the co-head of the Brain Trust podcast community, etc. I've been his longtime for a good while. Mm-hmm. And so I edited the zine suite that they put out for Zine Quest in 2019. Like, I kind of knew what was going into it, and it really was from the encouragement of the Brain Trust that I had this game that I had been working on. I saw so many other people kind of going to Kickstarter to raise funds, to put out these zines. And when I looked at my project, I was like, well, I see this as being a 30-page booklet. I don't think it warrants being more than a zine. I'm just going to put up a small Kickstarter, aim to raise $1,000 because I've printed books before. I know how much it's going to cost to print and ship these. If I raise that much, it'll be worth my time. And if I don't, then, at the very least, I have a mailing list. Mm-hmm. I can just put up an update after it fails that sends a ping to everyone saying like, hey, bummer we aren't getting the print editions, but just put it on itch.io. If you want to pay $5 for it, you can. And the other thing that I did is, I didn't tell anyone about this Kickstarter. I did not, pass the hat around friends and family. I didn't have an email list that I sent out saying like, hey, and this is, by the way, for listeners, this is very dumb. Don't do this. This was all like my own anxiety, lack of confidence, because I was so convinced that like it was just going to be a drop, in the middle of a lake somewhere and get lost, that I like was worried about like making a big stink about it and then nothing happening. And so I didn't really tell anyone about it other than the Brain Trust. I just kind of launched it, and then it funded day one, and then it kept funding, and then it eventually ended at about $20,000 raised. So suddenly this thing that had been a hobby of mine, one, I felt so encouraged and justified that like other people were interested in my work, but it also like it kind of became my job, which was really great because theaters had just shut down. Mm-hmm. And because the funds hit in February, I delivered the game in March, and I've been selling it on itch since then, digital and physical copies, and it's paid my rent for the entirety of 2020, which is crazy, and has also just been like, I don't know, really encouraging and affirming for my design process. I don't think you need to like have a Kickstarter exceed your wildest expectations to, justify yourself as a game designer. You know, if anything, I am envious of the people that, you know, are able to work in a vacuum and be satisfied by their work. But as someone who struggles with depression, as someone who struggles with imposter syndrome, like, I probably would still be in the headspace of like, you're not, you know, a real designer, if I hadn't had this like gangbusters experience, which is like, no, the analytical part of my brain says I made too much money doing this to just like write myself off as a fluke.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's so good. And it's not like, you know, as you were sort of alluding to earlier, Beak, Feather, and Bone is not your first game that you've ever like sort of dabbled in. I'm sure you have like a file or closet or notebooks full of ideas. You're like, oh, that's a good idea. Oh, maybe this. I'll try that.
Yeah, it was the one that I was like, well, this is done and it's polished and it would work well as a zine. Let's see what happens. I'm really glad that I did.
Yeah, you got in front of people and it just took off. And I think, you know, what sort of a subtle important lesson there is that in order for someone to get better as a designer, you have to present stuff in front of people, because you can certainly create in a vacuum, like you said, but I think there's something about finally setting it out there for a price and saying, cool, I made this game, it's $4, buy it, let me know what you think, and let your time be worth something, and then have that feedback inform the business you're now starting. Because you make one game and sell it, then you can certainly make more games and sell them, right? It's not impossible.
Yeah. And even if I had failed, like now as I'm gearing up to, you know, try and go like even more legit with my game stuff in 2021, because theaters aren't reopening anytime soon. Like I have so many numbers where I'm able to make like educated estimates of what I think I can do. You know, like it was like, all right, if I retain, you know, 50% of the people who backed my last Kickstarter, you know, like operating under that very conservative budget, like what could I actually do here? So we'll see. But at the same time, you know, I'm just as excited by other people's projects, and, you know, I'm grateful for the editing and the writing and stuff that I'm able to do there. So yeah, it's wild. It's wild out there.
It's the Wild West all over again. It's the Wild West all over again, folks. So let's talk Beak, Feather, and Bone. Let's do it. Let's talk about the artistic stuff. So you're going to do a much better job than if I were to introduce your game, even though I have looked through it. Why don't you give a little brief snippet about what Beak, Feather, and Bone is about for the people at home?
Yeah, so it is a map labeling RPG. All you really need to play are the rules, which are super, super simple. The rules are really only like maybe 20 pages of the 30-page booklet, because I really wanted to make it kind of like an art object as well. Austin Breed, who did the illustrations for it, and Jonathan Yee, who did the map for it, both did a really fantastic, beautiful job. And so it's like, I don't want to cram these into like a corner of a page somewhere. I want to give these pieces each their own page. But you start with an empty map, so it can be any kind of unlabeled map. There are map generators online, or I provide one with the game. And you can have any number of players, 1 to 10 really, but there's no reason why you can't have more. And you have a deck of cards, and you take turns going around in a circle and picking a building on the map and basically describing it. Each person flips a card. The card tells them some like value stuff and like what they should focus on. If like, oh, this building serves a financial purpose. This building serves a social purpose. At the start of the game, players also pick what community they're representing. So like they might be representing the miners or the farmers. So say it's the miner player's turn. They turn over a social card, which would be a heart. They would look at the map, pick out one of these squares on the map that's just an empty, unlabeled building, and they would describe that building's beak, feather, and bone. The beak is, all right, what would people say about this building? Like, what's its reputation if you were talking to a random NPC in the town? The feather is, what does it look like on the outside? You know, what is it painted a color? Is it like pristine? Is it falling apart? The bone is, what's it like on the inside? And that can either be a description of like the couches and chairs and stuff, or it can be, you know, the secret purpose. And once you describe those, you go to the next player. And basically it just goes around in this circle. And as you keep going, you continue to flesh out like what's actually inside these buildings on this map until you get to a certain point at the end. And then there's one more building selected as like the most important building in the town, with some kind of like lightly competitive stuff determining who gets to pick that. But it really is just a way of democratizing GM prep, you know, because you start with this empty map, and rather than the GM going and being like, well, I don't know which of these buildings the players are going to go into, so I'm either going to describe what's in every building or railroad them to specific buildings, or not plan anything and just improvise anytime somebody walks in. Because you and your players are kind of selecting which buildings are most interesting to you and giving just a snippet of, you know, what role they play in the city, you then, if you were to take this map and play a game with it, you know, these players are that much more invested in like learning more about the buildings that they've heard a little bit about so far. And also like you have this work that hopefully has been kind of fun, session zero type thing in itself. So suddenly all this busy work of GM prep just becomes like a different kind of game.
And that is exactly why I love it. What was sort of did it spark from that idea of that you're just trying to gamify GM responsibility, or was there a different spark for this game?
It was a bit of both. Really what it started as, like when I started trying to design and write my own RPG books, I very much had in my head the D&D source book style of writing. I was like, okay, if I want to make a product that people are going to want to read and going to want to use, then what I need to do is I need to commission a map, and I need to, which I did. Like I commissioned this map from Jonathan for this like city book that I was going to write. And I was going to be like, okay, and the rest of the book will be me defining every single building in this city so that a GM can just take it and use it. And the writing process was miserable. Like I hated it. It, you know, it was so much work that it really sucked all of the fun out of that process. And it also made me realize like, this isn't what I enjoy about role-playing games. Like what I enjoy about role-playing games isn't me like forcing my creativity onto others. It's like players reacting to each other's creativity. So really it was kind of already having, and this was 3 years ago that I started that project, having those materials and also like having my education in like more narrativist, more rules light, more GM-less type games that I was really enjoying reading and playing and writing in. Beak, Feather, and Bone was in a big way recycling like old assets that I had into something that's like, all right, I still want to play games in this city, but how can I do it with others, you know? And yeah, that was the impetus for then fleshing out the rules for, you know, all right, so how can we give the players enough that we're not just saying like, look at a map and come up with it on your own, but also not giving them so much where you might as well have just like labeled the map for them.
Yeah. Yeah. What I find really interesting about this, like as you were speaking, I think this whole sort of exercise of creating an environment with people, I would be so interested to see like actual play streams or podcasts adopt this game or the style of its rules to plan out those stories when people visit different places. Like I think about Critical Role and how that sort of sets the precedence for the mysterious GM novelist. It's like the players will always be surprised by the drama. I'd be so much more interested to see a world that's created sort of behind the scenes with everyone's input. Like I know that the players of Critical Role have some input on what different things look like or how they feel depending on the characters they make. But I don't know, I just think that this is not only such a beautiful game, but also a very powerful toolkit for groups of people that allow for, like, I would put this in my toolbox right now and say, okay, we're going to go to a new country or something like that. Let's whip out Beak, Feather, and Bone. Let's draw up a little map and talk about it. What happens here? Let's make up the whole history of this place and literally, what, it says it recommends 5 turns per player, so...
Yeah, you can easily play it in like, half an hour to 2 hours, really, depending on how much you want to dig in.
Right.
And they're actually, the Asians Represent podcast just last month did a session where they were like, all right, this is the city we're going to be going to. Let's play Beak, Feather, and Bone to like flesh out some of the political intrigue of this city. And they hacked it into a game called Jade, Silk, and Steel that when I get around to doing a BFB jam or something, they've said they're hoping to release it to the public. But it was so encouraging to see them take the little bits that they had done where they're like, okay, what are the factions we already have in our game's world? Like, let's switch those in for the miners and farmers. Let's take this historic map of an actual city in China. They're like, let's make our fantasy city using the rules of this game. And then also not to toot my own horn, but my favorite thing to come out of this game so far is that Friends at the Table played it for their Patreon. And Austin Walker has been like a huge inspiration to me as like a writer and thinker. And they played it, and they just recently announced that like the campaign that they're going to be running through their Patreon, their little extra campaign, is going to be set in like an MMO world where the players visit the different settings that they've created in one-shots. And they've said that they're going to include their Beak, Feather, and Bone town in that. So they haven't gotten to it yet, but like I am just like eagerly listening each week to be like, holy shit, they're gonna visit their version of Bird Town in this. So yeah. Which also was the working title for this game. Before I came up with Beak, Feather, and Bone, like because it fit with the rules, the working name for the project was just Bird Town.
I think I remember that because I think you were just switching the name as I joined the Brain Trust. So
yeah, it's probably about right.
Tyler, that is so fucking cool. You have that's amazing. I am blown away by all of that. The Asian Represent and the Friends at the Table sort of representation of your game in there, and how people are seeing that like this is a very adoptable tool. And at this point, I would say anyone listening to this who has home games, it is $5. Go to Itch and have yourself something that is going to give you the longevity of creation you so desire. Oh.
It's really interesting. Like when the game first came out, there were some super negative reviews of people so one of the big pitches of my Kickstarter was the game was done. I was like, it's done. If you back this, like, it funds in February, it delivers in March. And there's some Zine Quest projects that, almost a year later still haven't delivered. But part of getting it to people so fast is, people were like, oh, this is the first Zine Quest RPG I've actually gotten delivered. Like, I plan on reviewing each of them. And so there were a bunch of reviews of it. And folks who are reading it, just like based on the reviews, a lot of people were saying like, hey, I'm kind of disappointed that it's only 30 pages and like 10 of them are illustrations. Or people were saying like, this is like really pretty thin. Like I would expect more. And I think part of that is just that people are, like the D&Dification of RPG products is everyone is like, hey, if you aren't like crunching, double columns onto every page in size 9 font, like, you're wasting my money. But I've also just been so encouraged by reviews that have come out since then of people being like, 30 pages is short, but after playing it, I don't think it needs anything else.
Yeah.
And that's also like why I'm charging $5 for it. Like, I'm not pretending that it's anything that it's not. I think it's well worth your $5, but it's also not like, I would charge more for it if I put the kind of work that goes into, writing A Curse of Strahd, because even just like paying myself per word, like, I could never charge $5 for it.
Yeah, I think there really is this false expectation, especially with sort of like for me, I kind of rank games on like a 3-tier level of like the mainstream, which is where like D&D and Pathfinder and all that Warhammer sits, and there's like the semi-indie, which is where like Ironsworn and Blades in the Dark kind of sit, Powered by the Apocalypse kind of lives there, and then indie hacks like sort of within its own sphere underneath that. And I think there's this false dichotomy of that popular and or good game facilitates 200 plus pages in some fashion, and that doesn't necessarily always warrant a good game. I have no personal love for D&D, and they have 3 books that are 300 pages plus with all sorts of, I would say to some effect, useless information in it, very fluff type stuff. And like, I talked with, I can't remember which guest it was, either Adam or Spencer, about how it was Adam, how the DMG doesn't really teach you how to be a DM. It just gives you sort of a couple tables and says, here are some places that you can use, but it doesn't specify like, how do you approach different players at the table? I know it has a bit about sort of this is the actor player and these very generalized hats that players can be. But yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about how the perception of the size of a book, and not only that, but even the art of the book. Like some games have maybe 1 or 2 pages worth of art in them, and they're literally just the rules, and they're still amazingly great games, like just beautiful games. And yours certainly fit. I mean, yours has very beautiful illustrations and pieces in it as well, but at the end of the day, it's a pretty self-composed and simple game that, again, I think is well worth $5, even beyond the $5 for sure. So I guess the point.
If I can interject real quickly.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think
hit me with it.
Part of what I'm trying to do with BFB, and also part of what I'm really finding is kind of core to my design practice for my upcoming games, is that, like, yes, it is kind of gamifying GM prep, but hopefully it's also kind of teaching you how to be, a more open-minded and collaborative GM. Absolutely. Because my hope is that, like, even just hearing what you were saying, like, oh, after reading this game, I want to add it to my GM toolkit, because it isn't just like, it isn't a self-contained game where you're like, well, Thursday we're going to play Beak, Feather, and Bone, and Friday we're going to play, Cyberpunk or whatever. Like, it can be something that, like, yeah, sure, you can play it on its own, but also it can just be like a tool that you use in your game to kind of like bridge between cities or bridge between creative pieces of thought. So even though I also don't have a section, it's like a good GM always says yes, right. Like, I hope in some ways that, like, by virtue of playing a game that invites player contribution, GMs will take those lessons and be like, oh, I don't need to be playing Beak, Feather, and Bone to just ask one of my players casually, like, okay, what does the inside of this room look like? Instead of always defaulting to describing it for them.
Absolutely. One thing I wanted to touch on this, it's light in the rules, but sort of why the competitive element for the game. I know it's small, but why was that sort of put in there?
Yeah, so the competitive element of the game is that as you deal yourself these cards, you keep track of the values on them, and the person who has the highest value among their cards at the end of the game basically their faction or their community or their player has the most influence in the city at the end of the game. And so they get kind of to claim like kind of the throne. I call it the seat of power, which is whatever is like the most influential building in the city. So say if at the end of the game the miners had the most points, they'd be like, okay, the miners are in control of the seat of power. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's like a miner sitting on the throne. But that player might be like, okay, this is the mayor's house, and everyone knows that the mayor is in the pocket of the miners. And so all of the laws and things that are passed in this city benefit the miners. As far as the competitive element, I think it really was just trying to, and there are also rules for eliminating that element, or you don't really have to treat it as competitive. It can just be like, oh well, this is another rule and the person with this number does the last thing. The person with a 12 closes the book. But I was trying to make sure that like the game appealed to different kinds of player types as well. Like I still run D&D for my friend group because we've been playing it for years and years.
Sure, absolutely.
But I also know my players very well. Like, I know that Jordan is going to have his own storyline that he's going to want to pursue. Emily and Aaron are just going to want to tell jokes. And I know that Caleb is the power gamer who has spent like an hour with his player's handbook beforehand and has synergy planned out for all of his stats and all of his spells. And he wants to actually like do the power gaming. Like he wants to roll his dice so that even though he knows he's guaranteed to succeed, like he wants proof that he did the math right. And so even though it like isn't competitive for 3/4 of those players, I know that that's one of the things that makes it fun for Caleb. So I'm like, okay, I want to make sure there is something for him too. And so by adding the competitive element, like realistically, it's just a way to end the game. Like it's just a way to kind of have and here's where we stop. This is the last thing that happens, and so we have narrative resolution. But even just by using a word like competitive in the text, regardless of how competitive it actually is, because like it's all just random number generators.
Right.
You can't influence what cards you draw. Someone is able to like feel more invested in like the kind of the mystery of like what cards are going to be drawn next, So, and I've watched people in actual plays be like, get really invested and like, oh man, come on, give me that 9, give me that 9. And just like, really, that's all you need to include a rule. Like, it doesn't need to be core to your philosophy. Just like if there's a chance of one person saying like, give me that 9, then like, yeah, sure, why not? Give him the chance.
Yeah, that little gamble addiction, like yeah. Gambling addiction is very real. If any, we could provide numbers to things. It's very real. Shout out to Jordan, Emily, Aaron, and Caleb. I hope that as you hear this,
they're wonderful.
Your man Tyler is crushing it and impressing the ever-loving shit out of me. What I also really like about, I know that you can play the game without the competitive element, but what's really interesting about that sort of piece of the puzzle for me is the seat of power and how it's almost a complete recontextualization of the entire city you've been building so far, right? Because so far you don't know who's in control of the city, so you're spending a number of turns building out, let's even say 5 players. You've kind of mapped out 25 buildings and have maybe 10 rivals amongst them. And then you hit the seat of power. You're like, all right, who has the most? The mages. Now everything is recontextualized through what does this city look like when it's under the power of the mages, right? And I think that's really cool because one of the things that helps to, at least in my opinion, make like a town or an NPC or an adventure feel unique is just this final twist that says, okay, we've taken the hero's journey and we've removed this element and now it's a whole new thing, right? And I just think there's something really cool, especially when we talk about the toolkit side of using this. That seat of power says, man, this is the wow factor. This is the X factor that we've been missing since building this, and I think that's really cool.
It also, you know, it helps to, you know, it helps to create those empty spaces in the turns beforehand, because there's always a chance that things will change, you know? So I think in a way it is kind of teaching those GM skills, teaching those player skills of like, okay, be creative, but leave some open room for, you know, how this might be a little bit different. Or even it also kind of prevents someone from like domineering a game.
Exactly.
You know, because how often do you have that one player who like monopolizes the table time and like makes all these like big sweeping decisions about like, no, my character is the strongest person in this country because I said it first, and like now this is part of the canon. You know, one, like everyone has their turn. Two, like the rules dictate that those turns are always going to be like 3 sentences long. And then if someone were to say like, okay, this building is like the elevator guild, and there are elevators that take you above ground and underground, and my faction runs it, and everyone has to use them, and anytime they use them, they pay my faction. Like, okay, that's all canon part of the game. But like, by the end of the game, your faction still may not be in power. You know, they could still have the least amount of influence in the town. Absolutely. So it kind of makes you kind of like, nothing is definite. There's always a bit of a softening element of like, okay, like I'm saying this now, but next turn this could, you know, what that actually means could be like, then the magicians could say, but like, yeah, but we built the elevators, and so you give all that money to us.
Right. Yeah, I think all that is just scrumptious good stuff to have both in your arsenal, and also to what I also like about this game is that it almost has a tiny bit of this board game feel to it, and I love that this is also something you could like bring to for someone who's never played a role-playing game before. I think this is also a really good introductory game for people, where you could bring it, plop it down on the table. Here's the map. Hey, here's a deck of cards in the map, and here's how we're going to play this game. And all you have to do is just think about what your roles do here, period. I think that's really cool.
Because there is like a bit of a, yeah.
No, go ahead.
There's a bit of like a Candyland aspect to it. Of like you have the game board and you're just interacting with the game board.
Absolutely. This is a great game, and for, like I said, I think it can be the value, you know, what is value to the consumer at the end of the day. For me, definitely well worth beyond the $5. So, you know, there'll be show note links to where you can pick up Beak, Feather, and Bone, and I don't see why you wouldn't get it. GM, game designer, player, mother who wants to entertain her children at home, like I don't see who can't use this game. Just get it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And yeah, like that entry point is definitely something that I've tried to be cognizant of. Like my best play testers have been my younger brother and his wife, because they are farmers who don't play any games, digital or otherwise. And I was able to run Beak, Feather, and Bone for them over Google Hangouts, and they loved it. And were like, can we play this more next week? And I was like, yeah, sure. There's all kind of stuff like this.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
Shouts out to Luke and Andrea.
Yes, shout out Luke and Andrea. Tyler, before we get into talking about sort of future things, I always like to break up these segments with a little bit of a design trend, lightning round sort of thing. So what that means is I want you to think about either spheres that you are a part of or your own personal thoughts about trends you are seeing. Like someone keeps saying the same thing on your Twitter, or a lot of people are saying this on your Twitter or in the Brain Trust or something like that, or you've had a thought about a trend you would like to see happen or maybe disappear. to some effect. You can do both. I've had other guests do both of those. But what are some design trends you are seeing, and what are some design trends you are thinking about at this current point in time?
Yeah, I'm very curious about the kind of like, I mean, it's nothing new since, it's really like I'm sure there are older examples of this, but I'm by no means an RPG historian.
Sure.
But like the systemification of games, like Powered by the Apocalypse. It's like a kind of a core rule set that then can be like sub-licensed or hacked into other games. Your examples being like like D20 games, or, examples like Paragon, the new Aegon system and things like that. So I think that it is very fascinating, and I definitely see it as a good entry point for designers, as kind of like, okay, you have a little bit of an instruction booklet. It's kind of like, you buy the Legos and you build the set based on the instructions once, but then you still have the same pieces. And so after that, you can kind of take it apart and put it back together again. And because there's some kind of restraint in like the pieces that are available to you, it's almost like a safe space to be more creative, because you also know that like, well, it worked once. Like, it looked good once. Like, there is potential for something good in here. It's just how much can I improve on it, or how much can I kind of run with it? So that's definitely a trend that, has existed in like the bigger games, because in some ways that's how someone continues to profit off of their product.
Right.
Like the Blades in the Dark is perfect, Forged in the Dark type games. Like, that has become a tentpole of Evil Hat's like business structure, is like continuing to release new modules, new interpretations of this. And before that, they were doing the same thing with kind of the Fate games. I'm less interested in like the big tier systems though, and I'm more interested in like the micro tier systems. Like something that Will and Adam, for Brain Trust and the games that they've collaborated on, is they have made like the Powered by Phantoms rule set. Like, you can make hacks of their game, A Guide to Casting Phantoms in the Revolution. And there's so many other like little indie games that are like, hey, what I came up with was this like these couple cool pieces of tech, and people should use them. I think that game jam culture is excellent, for creativity. And a lot of people just kind of frame like, okay, here's our jam, make games inspired by this other game. But I would love to see like more kind of full-fledged products that really do like stand on the shoulders of giants and use like what is offered to them to the fullest. Like, not as like just a quick sketch watercolor, fun exercise, but I would love for someone to take like the Guide to Casting Phantoms in the Revolution structure and then like collaborate with Will and Adam to put out like a full length game that, is more the equivalent to a, Band of Blades, alternative to Blades in the Dark.
Right.
Does that all make sense? I feel
Yes.
like I got a little rambly there at the end.
No, you're super good. No, I think the same thing. So I always, when I talk to sort of my circle of friends about game design stuff, and one of the big thing, almost everyone I know kind of sticks strong to D&D, but one of the things I think is really disgusting of D&D is the DM's Guild situation, where they're taking like 20% of your profits to use their intellectual property. I know they have their own open gaming license for like the very simple pieces, but like there are people who have so many cool setting ideas, but they have been sucked into using, the Barovia set, the Magic the Gathering sets that are now out for the settings for the D&D games. And they kind of like continuously suck in those dollars while they're not the ones making the product, which I think is like that's partially on people wanting to use the intellectual property, but if it's there and they have the idea, they're going to use it. What I like about the Blades and the Forge in the Dark system models and everything that's sort of like sparking off of that as well. And I think, in sort of in a vein of Fate as well, is that it just feels a little bit cleaner. It's like we just want you to say, hey, this is the first game, this is the parent game for this game. Other than that, reap all the profits, reap all the benefits, use the kits that we have out there. And I just think there's something about that that's sort of boosting up of the game design community, especially for newer people who need that, like you said, safety net of like the original Lego ship they buy, and then they make 3 little starships out of that, right? And they don't have decision fatigue from all the other sets they've bought, and slowly they can start to incorporate. So I think you totally hit the nail on the head when it comes to this sort of trend of, and I know even our own Brain Trust member, Spencer Campbell, who I interviewed before, has a creator's kit for Slayers, and creator's kit's sort of his biggest Kickstarter project that's come to fruition. I know he's done a great job with Season and a great job with Corvid Court as well, but he also said, hey, if you have something for Slayers that you found really cool, and even hosted his own Slayers Jam, which was a big help with that as well. So like the systemification, is that what you said? Systemification?
I might have said that. But it's like to simplify, some of this is that, like, one of the big discourses is like, well, you see so many people being like, well, everyone plays D&D. And so here's my hack for D&D to create the kind of game that I want to play, through D&D. Like, it's the whole Tasha's Cauldron thing.
Yep.
It's like, here are ways to play D&D that are not D&D, when really, like, so much of that discourse is like, well, why hack D&D when there's another game that actually, like, the whole point is it's doing the kind of thing that you want, whether it's a style of play or a subject matter or things like that. And I think that as a designer, as someone who is, like, interested in hacking other games, like, just because a game has the biggest audience doesn't mean it has the best audience, like, because even if something like Guide to Casting Phantoms has a smaller audience, it is an audience of people that are specifically interested in what that game's doing. So if you were interested in creating a game that does similar things, you could either take, like, the big popular game and make something that, like, 90% of the people who play that game don't want. Or you could make a hack of the small indie game and know that, like, 90% of the people who play that would be interested in more takes on that, because that's why they play it. It's kind of like, in terms of hacking, like, okay, you can make the Fate module that, who knows if the thousands of people who play Fate it will resonate with, or you can make the Slayers module that the hundreds of people who play Slayers, there's a better chance that someone will really latch onto it and be able to give you the kind of actionable feedback you need as a designer, to actually improve the product. Because you need a smaller community if you're going to have any kind of meaningful playtesting.
Absolutely, 100%. And what's also nice is this microcosm also is the designers are also kinder, in the sense that when I think about, like you just said, Tasha's Cauldron and stuff like that, I have no doubt in my mind that there were people within Wizards of the Coast headquarters that are kind of just scanning DM's Guild to see, like, what's the most popular 20 pieces that people are latching onto, and how can we... I've seen it. I've literally seen it in other books where someone has made, like, a subclass or something that people love, and then they stick it in a book. And it's like, now we get to benefit from this twice. And I'm like, why do we let this happen? But it's again, sort of that skewed perception of what is, right now we have a tandem bicycle of role-playing games are D&D 5e. You know what I mean? Like, they're an interchangeable word for each other for sort of the surface level of people who know what a role-playing game is. In fact, it's also, for me, as much as I have my own issues with the game, it is still the way that I describe, like, yeah, I play role-playing games, like Dungeons and Dragons, because people have seen Stranger Things and have seen it in Target or whatever, and, like, they're able to translate that to something.
Yeah.
Without me having to
a
go.
real nightmare for like my Tinder profile. People are
Mm-hmm.
like, well, what's your job? It's like, oh, I work in tabletop art. I work in game design. And they're like, what kind of games? It's like, well, like tabletop RPGs. And it's like always the line that I use when they're like, oh, like this or that, or like Stranger Things. I'm like, yeah, it's like Dungeons and Dragons, but less fighting and more feelings.
Yeah.
It just is kind of the elevator pitch that I've come up with it. But it is weird, like the D&Dification of the hobby. You know, it is very much like you know, Kleenex is a brand. It's not a product, but everyone calls tissues Kleenexes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Is there any other design trends that are sort of running in your mind at this moment?
I think that's the big one. And unless you wanted me to like speak on my personal design trends.
Sure,
but
yeah,
I
absolutely.
think that I think the kind of work that I'm doing and kind of the tech that I'm working on in my future games is less a like I'm seeing this in the scene, so I'm leaning on it, and more of a this isn't what I'm seeing other people doing, and so I'd like to try and like advocate for this some, and you know, also kind of make a unique corner for myself as someone who's doing this kind of thing.
Great. What is that? What is that thing?
Yeah, so I am very, and it's the same with Beak, Feather, and Bone. I'm very into kind of spreading creativity throughout all players. And it also, to harken back to an earlier thing we talked about, you know, even in games where I think there are, like, I am not, like, hardcore anti-GM. You know, I think there are some games where GM is super valuable and necessary. I just want to make sure it's also fun for GMs. And so what I'm trying to work into my games is a democratization of creativity with, you know, like still opportunities for surprise, still opportunities for improv, still opportunities for reaction, you know, because like the thing that makes it different from just like an Exquisite Corpse, you know, run-on story or a game of telephone is like, yes, everyone having agency to be creative, but also like those seat of power moments where like things could change depending on how someone else interprets it or reacts to it. So a lot of what I've been working on for some upcoming games is something that I'm calling a fishbowl mechanic. Have you ever played the party game where like you have a bowl or a hat? My family plays it a lot during holidays, where like everybody writes down like a word or a phrase or a celebrity and like folds the piece of paper, puts it in a hat, and then maybe you have like two teams or something, and someone gets up and they have, you know, a minute to pull cards out. And like first round, they can say anything but the word that's on the card. And like second round, they can do charades. Or second round, they can say one word. Third round, they can do like just charades. But the thing that I'm taking from those is this idea of having like a community pool of everyone being able to put in, you know, different elements of creativity, kind of sometimes with other players' knowledge, sometimes without other players' knowledge. So the chief example of what I mean is the Superpower game that I'm working on. I really love, I'm a sucker for single unique power properties, you know, whether it's the X-Men, where it's like, all right, everybody has the one like cool mutant power, or it's One Piece, where it's like, all right, everyone has the one cool devil fruit power.
Shout out to One Piece.
Like Hunter x Hunter, like all of these different properties, My Hero Academia. It's a lot of anime.
Yeah.
But it's like the trope is that like, all right, everyone has one unique power. And sometimes like the One Piece is the prime example of this. Like sometimes someone ate like the lava fruit and they have cool lava powers. And like sometimes someone ate the mochi fruit. And it's literally like, okay, so mochi is like this rice dessert.
Yeah.
How do we make like a cool superhero who has all like rice dessert powers?
Yeah.
But I think that creativity is like super fun. So this single unique power game that I'm working on has a fishbowl mechanic where at the start of the game, everybody just writes down like 3 words on pieces of paper, puts them into a hat, shuffles them around, and then part of the game is drawing a card out, and like that's the basis for your superpower. So it's an opportunity for someone to flex those creativity muscles of being like, you know, it would be really cool, like a cactus power. I'm going to write cactus. And, you know, our game is going to have someone with a cactus power. But it also gives an opportunity for trolling.
Yeah.
Like someone could just write, someone could just write toilet.
Yeah.
And like, okay, my person has the toilet power. And then the creativity comes from like, okay, someone's got a toilet power. How do I how can I spin that? How can I be creative with like this inspiration that someone's given me? Like, how can I make like a still deep character? Because like One Piece spoilers, the guy with the mochi mochi power is one of the best guys in the entire show.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's fantastic. So part of this game is it starts with the fishbowl mechanic, and then based on some very simple dice rolls, basically the card with the character that you're working on, each turn you add like one additional facet to that character, and then you pass it clockwise or counterclockwise, or there's a small chance that you might get a roll that says like draw a new character. And so your character's done. No one's allowed to like define anything else for him. Whatever like items were written on it, you know, that is the extent of the canon we have on this character. And if we were to encounter him in the game, everything else is up for grabs. So kind of the same way that Beak, Feather, and Bone is this game where it's like, all right, the player agency is creating this map together, and the surprise and like the shift is, you know, the lightly competitive elements. This is a game where like, all right, the game is gamifying the GM experience of creating NPCs, but the twist on it is one, not having control over what kind of power is the basis for your character, and two, depending on how cards get passed around the table, everyone having a chance to make that exquisite corpse of a character. Where, you know, on turn 3, maybe it's your turn to decide, like, you know, who the toilet man's best friend is.
It's a sewer rat on first go. Wow, that...
And then the other piece of tech that I have for it is these cards are going to be passed around the table, you know, a variable number of times. There might be a card that, like, doesn't get a roll that says you retire it for a while. So it might get, like, 9 sentences of extra information on this character. But there might be one that only gets 2 sentences of information before they're retired and put in the middle. At the end of the game, kind of the pivot moment is going to be you're going to look at those cards, and depending on how many sentences are on them, that gives it a number. So you're going to have a 9 and a 2. And that's always going to be 2 different factions. So like how in these superhero shows you have the X-Men and you have the Brotherhood of Mutants, you know, you're always going to have 2 sides. Yeah. It's not necessarily going to be the good side or the bad side, but there's always going to be 2 sides. And who knows if Toilet Man is the hero of the show or the villain.
Yeah.
We just know that like he's, you know, he's on the Brotherhood of Mutants side.
Yeah. That's what a great
And that's another shift. Like you could spend an entire game like making like, all right, Cactus Man is a paragon of truth. And then at the end of the game, if he has an odd number of sentences, then like, sorry, he's on the bad guy's side. So how do we reinterpret the fact that like he never tells a lie? He's the George Washington of cactuses, cut down a cherry cactus, but he's a bad guy.
What an awesome way to create, again, both a really interesting game, but also another toolkit item to delineate how to create NPCs, but also factions at the same time. And what's nice about that is that sometimes I think, at least for me, when I create, I fall into this pit trap a lot, is that when I create a faction for something, I think of the faction like word or hat first, and then every NPC that's in there also kind of shares that hat. But with yours, it creates this very complex organization, right? Like there's so many different interesting personalities that will live in there, but then they can all wear the same uniform or whatever.
The unifying factor is the last thing you decide.
Exactly.
Because so you could go through an entire thing creating two polar opposite characters, and then the luck of the die says at the end, like, well, they're actually like coworkers.
Yeah. Wow. And I love the sort of codifying the fishbowl mechanic, because when I talked to Adam Bell about his game No Stone Unturned, he also does a very like beginning of the game sort of fishbowl thing where everyone writes down some notes about different areas around the settlement that they're in. And I love now that listeners out there have something to codify that sort of experience to this sort of like dip in, draw the prompt, call like this is now what you're reacting to, right? And I love that you always think about sort of that reaction instead of creating a game that's just like linear sort of, well, then this happens and then this happens and this happens. Something to shake the bag is always under consideration for the next move at some point. And I think that's a really like golden star thing for listeners to keep intact, is that part of the thing that makes, or at least for both me and Tyler, the thing that makes role-playing games for us is sort of that reactionary moment where something twists and now you have to decide the story has now derailed from what you thought it was going to be. But that's where conflict and interesting moments happen that allow you to continue that line without being bored. I think that if you keep following just that line, you get to a point where like it peters or stutters. It's like sort of the endless campaign syndrome where you don't really have a conflict. You're just doing like gonzo adventures week to week, and that's fine, but that can only last, I guess that depends on the person. That's not necessarily fair to make a sweeping statement like that. Yes, I'm the guy that makes sweeping statements in his game when I want everyone to think I'm the strongest person in the world.
Yeah, hey, we've said it here. You're the Jimmy Fallon of RPGs. Yeah. You make sweeping statements, reducing very complex issues into binary right and wrong statements.
I'm so mad because the Brain Trust is going to bully me after they hear this episode. Now my name's going to shift to Jimmy Fallon. Please don't do it. I still want to be a part of the community. Don't butt me out. No, I'm chill, but
it's your fault for tussling Gary Gygax's hair back in the day. You normalized him.
Wow. What do you have any thoughts of when you're going to start sort of putting stuff out for feelers? Like, hey, I've got this sort of single unique power game I'm playing with. Also, quick sidestep. I'm also a big like anime king person, so like if we ever want to chat about that, I'm hard on like Jujutsu Kaisen right now. I caught up on the manga.
I am caught up on the manga. Jujutsu Kaisen as well. It's so good.
I'm like,
they're not caught up to all of the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure anime.
Yes.
Well, it's really like it started in a similar place to my Beak, Feather and Bone prep, where it's like, okay, what does a good RPG book look like? Oh, it's me writing a world Bible for this city, realizing that like that's not the thing that I find enjoyable, and pivoting. At first, I was like, I want to write like a shonen RPG. Like I want to write something that recreates these kind of experiences. Like I want to recreate the episodic type storytelling. I want to recreate this, that, and the other. And like I was working on all of these resolution mechanics, and like I just at a certain point I lost the forest for the trees, and I realized that like, oh, I don't want to create like the system for how to run an anime RPG. Like I am not looking to compete with like Big Eyes Small Mouth, which is still like the dumbest name for an RPG. And also especially like as a white man, like how much is it my place to like create, the like to gamify a piece of like largely Asian culture. So pulling back is like, what do I want to do? Oh, really what I'm more interested in is this trend in Eastern and Western media of the single unique power shows. And really all I want to do is like create excuses to make like weird superpowers, because
Yep.
that's something that I enjoy as a GM. You know, even if I'm sometimes just pulling it out of my ass of like, okay, you meet this guy and he's a cactus man, you know, like I want to give players the opportunity too of being like, well, someone saw a lamp in the room and so they wrote the word lamp. What's this lamp superpower like? Because like that's the quintessential GM experience. It's looking around a room and seeing like, all right, what can inspire what's behind this door? Yeah.
House.
Yes, the mayor's name is Birdhouse. First name Bird, last name House. So to answer your earlier question though, like this is the first time I've really talked to anyone about it. So you're getting a scoop. This is me putting out the feelers.
Ground floor alert.
And the other thing is that I am gearing up for my next big Kickstarter in 2021. In part to pay for the taxes of my last Kickstarter, because I didn't expect for it to do as well as it did. And I wasn't in the right position to like budget appropriately, especially with the pandemic hitting. I was like, I wasn't saving money. I was just lucky to be paying my bills. So with 2021, I'm not going to be doing Zine Quest, knock on wood, unless someone like peer pressures me into it. I might collaborate with someone, but I'm not planning on running anything. I am planning on running a campaign before tax deadlines so that I can raise enough money to pay taxes. But my goal is to run a Kickstarter that is more of a subscription model for these little games. I have about a dozen of these micro games, very similar to my single unique power game, that are somewhere between a game and a tool. And still figuring out the exact number that I'm going to offer, but the structure of the Kickstarter will be like 2 price points, one for a digital subscription, one for a digital subscription plus a box set at the end. And the idea being that like, all right, for $25, you'll get 6 games, you know, 1 game delivered digitally each month. And then at the end of 6 months, if you pay the premium price, you'll also get sent a box that has those 6 games in print. And with the idea being that I will be creating a revenue stream for myself of like, all right, what is the point of the Kickstarter? It's to raise a lump amount of cash all at one time. You know, similar to the way that theaters sell subscriptions. You know, you're basically generating the operating money for the rest of the year. And then as I release these small games one by one, hopefully more people then discover the project. They go to a backer kit to pre-order it. And then, you know, I'm not going to be selling any of the physical games until after the boxes are delivered. But then once the boxes are delivered, I have, you know, these 6 games that I can also sell piecemeal. You know, I don't need to bundle them in like a $50 box. I can just sell them for $10 each, you know, with the idea being that like, how do I seize on the success of my last Kickstarter? And how do I stay true to myself as a designer, as someone who likes simple games, as someone who likes small games, but also knowing that like, all right, if I want to make this my full-time job, I need to make more money than a Zine Quest. So the solution is I don't want to write the competitor to D&D. I don't want to write the game that is, you know, here's my world Bible, and because it's 200 pages, I'm going to charge you $60 for it. I would rather say like, hey, you know me, I'm good at these little games. You can have 6 for $60. Because then I actually have a value proposition for like, well, for Beak, Feather, and Bone, there were 2 tiers, $5 for digital, $10 for physical. You know, how do I justify having 2 tiers that are $25 for digital and $50 for physical? Well, it's by offering more. So we'll see, but that's the plan. And it, you know, it really is, it has been like an ongoing process of being like, you know, a lot of the conversation that we've had here today of identifying trends, identifying like what the market is interested in, but also, you know, identifying my own talents and my own passions and making something that is going to like give back to me as a designer and just like the life and joy that it brings me, rather than just like, you know, losing my soul making something that I think that other people want.
Right. Which is always the slippery slope for any artistic endeavor, for sure. I'm sure that products and tools also feel this in some way, but you at some point have the thought that, like, I would like to make as much money as possible from this. And sometimes that thought leads you to, like, what does everyone else want and what can I supply them? But I think there really is this balancing act between holding true to your tenets of design or artistic creation versus what people want to pay, or how long it's going to take to find the people that want to pay for that sort of thing. I think there's always a person out there who will pick up what you're putting down, but how many of those people can certainly be differing depending on the spheres or bubbles that you access. And to touch on the sort of subscription model thing that you're thinking of, I know that Spencer's also very much like on this idea of the season pass and had a very similar thought to you for his light game that he's creating, which is his Heartbreaker 2 Destiny. He is going to release modules every quarter, like four modules a quarter, something like that. And at the end of the year, that's going to come into a culmination of a print book that anyone who's like bought all 3 season passes, or all 4 season passes, will be able to get that book in a physical form at the end of the year, and then people can still buy piecemeal for the little bits, back end sort of stuff. And he's trying to figure out how to do that over on Itch or through Patreon or whatever. But I think it'd be a nice connection for the two of you to kind of talk about that business structure.
Yeah, and I mean the biggest thing is just like, part of why my idea for the model, and I imagine Spencer's is the same, is like having a print product only at the end of the process, is because shipping really is like the hidden demon of this entire endeavor. Like, because no one wants to pay for shipping 6 times. It would be unrealistic to ask them for it, and it would be really hard to budget for it, especially as shipping costs, rise and fall with like the lightest of breezes. By doing something where like, okay, at the end of the process, we backer kit you for the exact shipping cost, it makes that kind of subscription model that is really just a digital subscription with a premium print tier so much more attainable.
Yeah, absolutely. All good stuff. Everyone, you should have your notebooks out. I don't ever say it at the beginning of the show, but you should be taking notes on everything this man is saying.
You should be listening to this at 0.5 speed, transcribing every word. No, I am one of those monsters that listens to all podcasts at 3 times speed.
Yeah, same.
Because I listen to entirely too many podcasts. But also, like, I started doing that because of actual play podcasts, because there's so many, like, uhs and ums and like thinking and things. It was like, all right, this is much more efficient if I listen to it at 3 times speed.
Yep.
But then I found myself like working up a sweat GMing at the table because I was like running everything so fast. I was like, why am I doing this? Oh, it's because all the GMs I listen to at 3 times speed. Like, this is not a realistic expectation to have for myself.
Yeah, and then you get the billing, and then I need you to roll to take damage.
Exactly. It would be like someone would say, like, I opened the door, and like, I would not give myself a chance to think. I would just be like, cool, behind the door, you see a slug. It is very big. It's your best friend.
That's all the room has.
Yeah, I would just like talk and talk and talk and just be like, what am I doing?
The last little bit here is sort of TLDR advice section. So I have a little table here that I'm going to roll on. 4. With whatever knowledge you have at your disposal, would you give the listeners a little tip about marketing when it comes to the game design sphere? Just whatever you think, that sort of, whatever comes to mind on the prompt of marketing.
Yeah, I think marketing is something that I have always struggled with, specifically with my game stuff, because, so much of my day job running a publishing company was like, all right, I get on the Plays in Verse Twitter and I promote our next book. Like, you know, it was very much like a work type thing for me. And before, like, I really embraced, you know, my game design as part of my overall like income and livelihood. You know, I wouldn't really talk about my projects that much, in part because of like the lack of confidence stuff I talked about before, and in part because like I just, you know, it felt like work. But really, and I wouldn't have thought of it as marketing at the time, but I think that it serves kind of the same purpose. I think part of why Beak, Feather, and Bone did so well is because I may not have been like marketing my own projects, but I was interacting with the community and I was championing other people's projects. You know, even definitely like when I had some skin in the game for like projects I edited, I would be really proactive in making sure that, you know, folks knew about those and like helping to market those projects, but also just like, you know, retweeting Brain Trust projects, you know, making friends and like even when I had nothing to gain, supporting other people in the scene and like calling out cool work when I saw it. That when I launched my project, you know, so many people were willing to back day one because they were just like excited to help support me. And so when I think about like the kind of marketing advice I can give, it is much less like, oh, budget this much for ads. It really is like, you know, especially in the indie space, you're selling the game, but you're also selling yourself to a degree. And that's always going to feel kind of icky because it doesn't, you know, it's not fun to like commoditize yourself. And really the only way that you can get around that is make it so you don't have to sell yourself. And the way that you don't have to sell yourself is just if everybody knows who you are already, you know, like you don't necessarily need to pitch yourself if you walk the walk in your everyday life. And if you're kind of already like showing people the kind of game designer that you are through like your words and deeds. So as people think about like, all right, what's the best marketing for my game? I think the best marketing for your game is simply having people know who you are well enough that when it's like, all right, hey, there's a new Tyler Crumrine game, like people are like, you know, they like Tyler Crumrine. And yeah, it really is. It's, you know, I don't think be sleazy about it, but just like be a person, you know, like this is too small of a scene, like engage with it. And to not like get excited about other people. And the more you signal boost other people's work, the more they're going to return the favor when, you know, there's something that you have and they're not going to do it out of obligation. They're going to do it because they like genuinely want to support you.
Yeah, I listened to this. Everything you're saying is beautiful. There's this podcast I listened to called The Creative Pep Talk by Andy J. Pizza. He always harps on how can you, and I don't mean when I say the word value, I don't mean it like a marketer, like what's the value of our toothpaste here today, but like really giving value to your community and supporting and lifting up other people, and those things will pay huge dividends to you when the time comes to sort of call on that swell. And that doesn't mean like, you know, boost up people and then say, hey, can you boost my game since I've been boosting you? Like, don't do that. Do not do that version of that.
Process of calling in favors.
Yeah.
It's a process of being a part of a community.
Absolutely.
You know,
absolutely.
Like a community like helps each other because they care about each other, not because like they're worried that, you know, the landlord will raise their rent if they don't.
Yeah. It's Jim always comes and helps us to put up the barns every day. And it looks like he's kind of struggling over in the cornfield. You know, let's take a break from the barns today and kind of help him harvest. You know, it's that sort of like small town, everyone knows who you are, and can see like when you're finally able to like really fall in love with something and people will want to support you. I've seen it all over the place, especially within the brain trust. These last 3 episodes have also had like massive brain trust energy, and if no one's catching a theme yet,
I mean, it's because we're a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah. No one's ready for what's about to come out of this Discord for sure.
Yeah.
Tyler, I want to thank you for for your time, for everything you've provided for the listeners and for myself today. Where can people find you if they want to find out more about you, or if they want to just touch base with you about an idea you said here today? By the way, all these links that he is about to say will be in the show notes.
Yeah, so a couple places. Best place to get a hold of me is probably on Twitter. My handle is @acoolguy, cool guy. I might be changing this handle soon if I revamp my Twitter into like a games company type thing. But mostly I just wanted to like write into podcasts and them have to say like a cool guy on Twitter ask this question. But you can find me on there if you search Tyler Crumrine. Crumrine.info is my personal website. That really needs updated too. Best place to go is really my itch. It's just, well, let me find out what it is. I know it's my name. Tyler-Crumrine, CRUMRINE.itch.io. And that's going to show you all of my like currently available tabletop projects, including Tail, Scale, and Bone, which is the first official expansion of Beak, Feather, and Bone, recontextualizes it as all mermaids because there's really no reason that the map couldn't be underwater. And all of the funds that I raise through that get donated to prison abolition here in Pittsburgh. The Allegheny County Jail has just like really abysmal numbers on patient depression and suicide. And about 80% of their inmates they just can't afford bail. So, if this all sounds interesting for you, and if you want a template for like ways that you could hack and expand Beak, Feather, and Bone in a way that kind of builds on the rules rather than like, plagiarizing them, that's a great example. It'll cost $1 and it'll kind of show you the kind of thing that I'm going to encourage people to make whenever I throw an eventual like BFB jam. Because it is just going to be one of those things. It's like, hey, do whatever the hell you want as long as you don't lift the core rules wholesale so that someone still like just needs to at least be familiar with the original game to use it.
That is all great stuff. And, I, as a quick aside, living in Pittsburgh, fun fact for everyone at home, I used to live in Pittsburgh, and our guest here is also stationed up there in Pennsylvania in Millvale, right? Is that right? Did I mess that up? Millvale?
Yeah, Millvale.
A small connection with him.
Represent.
Yes, there it is. Represent. But I lived right next door. Our dorm for the Arts Institute was right next to the jail over on First Street.
Exactly what you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So help support a great cause by picking up Tail, Scale, and Bone, everyone. Tyler, it was an absolute pleasure having you here today. For everyone at home, I hope you learned a lot.
I also hope you learned a lot.
Yes.
I also hope you have a good day.
Bye, everyone. Say bye to the people, Tyler.
Goodbye. Do good at everything, I guess.
All right, that's a wrap. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and hang out with Tyler and I. We really appreciate it. You can find links and resources down below in the show notes, such as getting in touch with Tyler or other episodes with similar topics. If you want to be a part of the conversation, please come and join the community Discord server. Also, make sure to subscribe to the Draw Your Dice Patreon, where you can get access to early releases of episodes from as soon as we interview. Thanks again for stopping by, and as always, I will catch you next time.